All right, hello everyone, and welcome back to Unit 3 SAC Tips Part 2. We did Part 1 earlier today. It's about 20 minutes long. If you haven't watched that yet, I'd probably start with that because what we're going to do now is continue on with the final 9 dot points. Turns out we went through 7 in the first video, all about Area Study 1, kind of a general overview of what each dot point means and the kind of questions that you're likely to be asked based on that. Hopefully going to go a little bit more in depth in this one. Hopefully still going to go for around 20 minutes. We'll see how we go. Because a lot of this feeds into what we talked about before. So let's get right into it and we'll go to our first dot point, which is all about the role of relative prices in markets on the allocation of resources and living standards. So really big thing here is it's often focused on businesses when you talk about this, but it can also be consumers with relative prices. So relative price is all about the ratio in selling price between two goods and services that are relatively similar. So, and it's really important that selling price. So ratio of selling price. So with businesses, so let's just say, we'll go with the classic example we always have. So apples and oranges. If they're both originally worth $2 for the selling price and apples goes up to $3, producers are going to move their productive resources into producing apples because they're more relatively profitable. And that's a great terminology to use because they're more relatively profitable. The businesses are getting more profit for them and they are happy about that. Whereas for consumption, if the price goes up to $3, consumers are going to move their spending resources away from apples and towards oranges because they're going to give them more relative, like utility. They're going to maximize their utility by purchasing oranges. So that has the opposite effect between businesses and consumers. So in terms of the effect on living standards, if the relative price increases, well, for businesses, you're really going to talk about relative living standards that much there. But for consumers, it means they're going to move towards purchasing whatever's cheapest because that's going to maximize their material living standards and hopefully their non-material as well. So just in terms of the allocation of resources, businesses are going to allocate their resources towards whatever's more relatively profitable, and consumers are going to move their resources to whatever is cheapest because it's going to maximize their utility. So in terms of questions based on relative prices, they're really, if it's in short answer, you're going to get questions like explain how relative prices can lead to a change in the allocation of resources, and you just need to talk about what they are with an example. In multiple choice, it's been a little bit different. So like sometimes you'll get things like there's a question about dresses are $3 and shirts are $9 to produce. What is the relative price? And it was like for every one shirt you make, you can make 3 dresses, and ended up being a ratio. So be aware of things like that, working out the benefit or the ratio between them, but keep an eye out for that kind of thing, as I almost poke my own eye out scratching it. Next up, the meaning and significance of the elasticity, price elasticity of demand and supply. A lot of students really struggle with price elasticity. It's really important to be good at it, but it can be pretty complex. So it's all about responsiveness of quantity, and it will be demanded or supplied to a change in price. Mostly with price elasticity, it tends to be theoretical questions because it doesn't technically, like it says in the key skills to be able to construct supply and demand diagrams. So technically you could have to draw diagrams to elasticity, but that's never happened before. It most often tends to be multiple choice or short answer questions. And so we're going to get into the factors about it next. But if you need to know in terms of the sake of what they are, elastic demand looks like a flat curve like that because a small change in price leads to a great change in quantity. Unit elastic looks like a 45-degree line like that. That's just a theoretical diagram we use. You're never really going to get asked a question about that. And inelastic demand looks like that. That's for our necessities or addictions because a large change in price isn't really going to affect our demand that much. For supply, it's the opposite. Elastic, unit elastic, inelastic, and knowing basically why they are like that. So factors affecting price elasticity of demand, so the degree of necessity, availability of substitutes, and proportion of income and time. All these really are. These are just the factors, the only factors you can be asked about with elasticity of demand. And you need to be able to explain, firstly, what they are. So explain them. And then link that to elasticity. So why degree of necessity would mean that a large change in price only affects quantity demand a little bit, or why the availability of substitutes might impact that. Why time would be a big factor, so why things would be inelastic in the short term, but elastic in the long term. And so sometimes with multiple choice, you'll get just a scenario. So say if Sam had to fly to Brisbane tomorrow, this is likely to be a bit like demand elastic, demand inelastic, supply inelastic, and you'd have to pick based on that. In short answer, you might be given the factor and then have to explain it, or you might need to provide a factor to explain the elasticity of a certain good or service. So being able to do that would be very, very excellent for you. So being able to name that factor, naming that factor is really important. These are the terminology that VCAR likes, so you should probably try and use those, and then explain it using examples if possible. For supply, so factors affecting elasticity of supply, so spare capacity, production period, and durability of goods. So spare capacity, that just means if you're using your resources to their fullest. If you are not, it means you can quickly increase production, which means things will be more elastic. Production period, how long it takes to make. So things that can be made quickly, well, that's going to be great. That's going to mean that they're more elastic. If it takes a long time to produce, so say growing fruit and vegetables, they're going to be more inelastic. Durability of goods, just basically how storable they are, that also gets talked about. So things are perishable. So things that are perishable are inelastic because it's hard to supply more because you can't store them. And if they are storable, they tend to be more elastic. So once again, exact same deal as what I said about questions with demand. You're either going to have to identify what they are in a multiple choice question, or in short answer, be able to use one of these factors to explain what you are talking about. Then we've got the meaning and significance of economic efficiency, allocative efficiency, productive efficiency, dynamic efficiency, and intertemporal efficiency. So if we're just to go through each of these efficiencies one by one, then we'll talk about the type of question. So allocative efficiency is when maximize society's well-being. So it's when there is no other combination of goods and services that could make society's well-being any better. So there's no possible combination that can make you better off. Productive efficiency is lowest cost for maximum output. Dynamic is changing to meet society's changing needs and wants. And intertemporal is balancing now versus the future. So in terms of multiple choice questions, it's usually just identifying which one. So it's really just giving a situation and saying which efficiency it is. So they're pretty easy. In short answer, quite often you get a distinguished question where you kind of have to define both and point out the differences between them with examples. Then otherwise, sometimes you get some questions where like it will be a bigger mark question, like an evaluate or discuss question about efficiency, where you'll probably bring in one or two of these to help with your answer, in which case you just be describing it a little bit and talking about how achieving that efficiency is going to help achieve living standards overall or improve living standards overall. The effect of competitive markets on the efficiency in resource allocation. So this is what I talked about a little bit with perfect competition in the previous PowerPoint with part 1. So when we're talking about this, so competitive markets obviously tends to allocate resources in the most efficient way possible, because in competitive markets there are many buyers and sellers. No product differentiation or homogeneous products, if you want to sound really smart. Ease of entry and exit, or no barriers to entry. And firms are price takers. It just means they have to take whatever price consumers are willing to provide. And we sometimes refer to that as consumer sovereignty because they have to produce whatever consumers are demanding. Sovereignty. All right, so here we go. So with this, like I was saying before, it tends to start coming up more and more in a discuss or evaluate question. So discuss the impact of competitive markets on the allocation of resources or living standards, or evaluate the impact of competitive markets on living standards. So what you need to be able to do is talk about the strengths and weaknesses of this for living standards. So the positive things, well, if firms are having to be as efficient as possible and firms are price takers, it's going to help maximize material living standards because consumers are going to be paying the lowest price for high quality goods. Because if firms are not as efficient as possible, they will go out of business. Whereas on the downside, often because businesses are producing whatever consumers are demanding, the goods and services that they demand, often it leads to an overproduction of socially undesirable goods. So cigarettes, alcohol, gambling, etc., which leads to living standards desirable, leads to living standards being worse off. So it's a really important thing to bring up. In terms of an evaluate question, in economics, we tend to go with like one advantage, one disadvantage. Sometimes it's 2 and 2, depending on the market allocation. If you know more, include it. And a really, really important thing with an evaluate question is you need to come to a conclusion at the end. I've been looking at a few lately where people aren't concluding. And what you need is you need a conclusion at the end where you say one way or another. So is it leading to living standards being better or worse off overall? We need to know that. So this is one of the more complex ones overall. We need to talk about it. Other than that, sometimes like last year's exam, it was just like describe the features of a competitive market. In which case, just talk about some of those 4 factors in detail and you will do great. All right, next up, we've got reasons for market failure, which is whenever the allocation of resources does not maximize living standards. So with all of these, you need to be able to describe what it is and talk about why, if it occurs, living standards will be worse overall. So in terms of multiple choice, so if we look at your MCQ, really you're just given, most of the time you're just given scenarios and you just have to pick what type of market failure it is. In terms of short answer, it can go either way. So with short answer, it could be you might be given one and have to explain how it affects living standards, or you might just be asked how one type of market failure could occur, in which case you'd kind of talk about what it is and give examples. So public goods, the fact that they are non-rivalrous and non-excludable, meaning that anyone can use them and one person's using it doesn't negatively impact someone else. The reason why public goods often, we don't have enough of them often, is because they are non-profitable, like they don't make any money, therefore the government has to provide them. If the government didn't provide them, our non-material living standards might be far worse off. Externalities we tend to talk about as a positive or negative impact on a third party from production. Usually we just go with pollution for that because it's the easiest to talk about, and how that makes living standards worse off overall. Asymmetric information, when someone, like one person in the transaction has more information than the others. We usually talk about this with used car salesmen because it's the easiest example. Sometimes they know more about a car than they might otherwise and sell it to the person, even though it might have defects. Then that person might allocate their resources in a way that actually makes them worse off overall. Then lastly, common access resources are very similar to public goods, but they are rivalrous, which means that the consumption of it by one person means that there is less available for the next person. I often talk about common access resources in terms of fish in the ocean. If everyone could just fish as much as they want, we'd run out of fish in the ocean because people would keep doing fishing because fishing is profitable. They can sell those fish, and the consumption of those would mean that there's less available for other people. And so with all these types of market failure, it means that we then need things in place to prevent them or fix them, correct that market failure. So then we've got here the role and effect of indirect taxation, subsidies, government regulations, government advertising as forms of government intervention in the market to address market failure. So all these are just ways to correct market failure. So usually with the market failure question, it might then have like an extra part where it's like, explain one way the government could intervene to correct this market failure. might want a recent example, or any example at all. It's really good to be able to use examples. Hopefully you'll be doing some research to get some real world examples here, because it's really, really good to start using real world examples. So indirect taxation. So you could look at things like cigarette taxes and how that's meant to correct market failure. You could look at plain packaging and how that's meant to correct market failure. So by letting people know of how their living standards will be affected, hopefully they will make better decisions based on that. Advertising about gambling. So that obviously the negative parts of it, all the government disclaimers, all that is designed to prevent or correct market failure and try and fix the allocation of resources to maximize living standards to hopefully achieve that allocative efficiency. And then lastly, we've got one contemporary example of government intervention in markets that unintentionally leads to a decrease in the efficiency and resource allocation. So with this, there's usually just one short answer question on it. It's usually explain one example of government intervention into a market that's led to a decrease in the efficiency of resource allocation. It's almost exactly this dot point. Realistically, you should be doing research on this. If you haven't already, there are videos on my page that will talk about a few of these in detail. You just need to know one. So pick one, get really good at it. You need to know what it is, what it intended to do, like what. So you want to talk about what they were actually trying to do. But then what actually happened. So there's usually going to be a 4 or 5 mark question. I tend to talk about the NBN because it's fun to pick on the government for that. It's also like you talk about like JobMaker. There's a lot of things the government has done recently, like the COVID Safe app, and why these are examples of market failures or government failures, because they've led to the allocation of resources being worse, because they've put a lot of financial capital into producing these things that have not actually had the impact they've promised they would have. But there's a link to this where I did a video last year on contemporary examples of market failure. Any of those would still be relevant, and they go into it in a lot more detail than I could go into in a few minutes here. All right, so that's it for this part 2. I'm going through these last 9 dot points. So between this and the first video, there's like 40 minutes of hopeful SAC tips. Even like I said before, the past exam questions, that video is really useful for this as well, in terms of all your different ones about structuring questions. If you go through my YouTube page, if you go into like the exam prep playlist, there's a whole bunch of stuff just about like the types of questions you'll get asked, the types of words you should be used, all that skill-based stuff is all there. If you want to find it, is really useful to get working on that now. It's even, there's videos to do with drawing diagrams and all that kind of stuff, just to try and get you on the right track. If there's anything else I can help you with, let me know in the comments or send me an email. Join our Discord, come to my website, hang out, give me ideas for blogs. Like if you've got any ideas for blogs, let me know. I'll write about them. Why not? So www.therunningeconomy.com. The link will be in the description below anyway, but join the Discord. People will try and help you out. Other than that, I hope you have a wonderful day. Now it is cooling off. It's like 24 degrees rather than 40 like it was earlier. I hope you have a wonderful night, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.